All right, so today we're going to be looking at converting fractions into decimals and decimals into fractions. Let's begin with a fraction. If I gave you this fraction, okay, how might you say this? Well, there's a couple ways of saying it. You can say 1 over 10. You can say 1/10. Or actually, this line means divide. We can say 1 divided by 10. Okay, so those three different ways to say this. Now, the most common way that you'll hear students say, oops, there's that, is 1/10. Wow, I'm making lots of mistakes here. 1/10. Well, this sounds really familiar because this is what we normally see as a decimal as well. So this is as a fraction form, and this will be for decimals. Notice when we were talking about place values, we have hundreds here, tens here, units or ones here. Here's where we have our tenths, our hundreds, and our thousands. So those were the most challenging ones for students, but we see here the value of tenths. It's the same here as it is here. Well, it's not a coincidence, it's actually math. So when you see a value, for example, 1/10, the way you say it and the way you write it will be the same. This is as a fraction. As a decimal, actually we say 0 and 1/10. Or we can just say, we can ignore the 0 and say 1/10. Let's try another one. We can try, for example, 5 over 10. And if we were to convert that into a decimal, it would be 0 and 5/10. Again, we would say here, we would normally say, oh, this is 5/10. Well, guess what? This is 5/10. And it works out, as we found out when we were learning division. If we have the number 5, if I take the number 5 and I divide it by 10, right? 5 is the same as a 5 with a decimal. Since I'm dividing by 10, I'm going to move that decimal to the left, and that gives me 0.5. So it's the same rules that we've been learning, and this is just a shortcut of how we do it, right? So the way we use our language as well as the way we use the operations should function and work the same. We can also use long division, but we'll talk about that down the road as well as a way to see it as a decimal. Notice here, if I gave you this number, so we're going to go from decimal to fractions now. If I gave you a number such as 0 and 12, notice the 2 is in the hundreds place. So we say 0 and 12 hundredths. Well, it's not surprising that if we were to convert this into a fraction, we're going to keep our same number, 12, and this time it's over, guess what? 100. Because again, we will say 12 hundredths. 12 hundredths. Yeah. So when we're looking at the values, what's going to be important is looking at where do the last digits end. So if the last digit ends in the tenths, that most likely means that the denominator or the bottom part of the fraction will be a 10. If it ends in the hundredths, the bottom will be hundredths. Okay, so let's take a look at another example. What if I were to give you the value of 0 and 252? 0 and 252, what position? Again, we say thousandths. So as a fraction, we would say 252 divided by 1,000. And that will help us to see how the numbers operate. Where it gets tricky oftentimes for students is if we get a value like, what if we get 12 over 10? Well, that's a really strange question, a really strange looking fraction. Well, it is a strange fraction because normally we call this an improper fraction because it's more than one value. But again, we can think of it as 12 divided by 10. We can move that decimal over, okay? And when we do that, we're going to get the 1 and 2/10 over, oh, I'm sorry, not over, this is a decimal, 1 and 2/10 is all we get. And this should make sense because we see here in the denominator we have a 10. And notice that the 2 is in the tens position. So yep, 12 divided by 10, or 12/10, is in fact 1 and 2/10. So when we start adding whole numbers into the equation or into the expression, it does kind of change the way it looks and maybe sounds. Like I said, we're going to practice with these in our class. If you're having a hard time converting between the two, please make sure you add comments, and I'll see if I can find other ways to help you.